All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome to HIV 2020, Where Are We Now? Today, we'll be talking about the intersection of HIV research and community service and the disconnect that sometimes happens between the two. And ultimately, we have a fantastic trio of panelists who will be placing science, health, and art side by side to really dig deep at the goals that still need to be met to make a difference in the HIV community. I'm Alexa McCourt, a media and events coordinator at QBI, and today we have with us the one and only Judd Holtquist, an assistant professor of medicine who studies HIV, award-winning actress, activist, and storyteller Rhodessa Jones, and the magnificent Edward Mottinger, a professor of medicine and a leader in trauma-informed healthcare. So before I turn it over to you guys, I want to welcome our viewers to ask questions at any time using the comment section on Facebook or YouTube. I'd be happy to relay your questions to our panelists and get you involved in this conversation. Okay, so to get us started, and before we dive deeper into how you became interested in the HIV realm, could you each briefly tell us who you are and more about what you do? Judd, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having us today. This is really a great event. I'm Dr. Judd Holtquist. I'm an assistant professor of medicine and infectious diseases at Northwestern University in Chicago, Illinois. So my daily life is really DNA, proteins, molecules, and viruses. That's what I love to think about and what I love to work with.
Great. Eddie?
Hi, I'm Eddie Mottinger. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. I direct our women's HIV program and our new Center to Advance Trauma-Informed Healthcare. Mostly at my core, I'm a primary care doctor running a frontline clinic for women and girls living with HIV.
Great, thank you. And Rhodessa, tell us who you are.
There's where I enter. I'm Rhodessa Jones, and I'm an artist, activist, performer, director, and I've created something called the Medea Project, Theater for Incarcerated Women. And it is about finding a way for women to tell their stories as a way to look at their lives, as a way to make decisions about where they're going, what they're doing. And I have been doing this work for such a long time, and meeting Dr. Mottinger, it has gotten richer because it helps me to understand that women simply need a voice. And if they have a voice, they can speak out about what's happening to them. And there's a healing effect to just saying out loud, this happened to me. And so I've been working with Eddie Mottinger for a few years, 10 years at the Women's HIV Clinic. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So Judd, I'll start with you. What's your story and what really got you committed to exploring HIV research?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Kind of, to build off of what Rhodessa was saying, it's about telling your story. And my own personal story, especially in regards to HIV, has been one that's been steadily evolving over the past, few years. It really started out when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do for, my graduate work, what I really wanted to focus on when I'm studying proteins and DNA. And the time of my life in which I was trying to decide what it is that I wanted to study was right around 2006, 2007, where it was fairly in vogue for conservative politicians to be passing these quote unquote sanctity of marriage acts, where they would be banning gay marriage. And it was a really important time for me in my community as a gay man to begin going out and talking with people about what does marriage mean to you? What does it mean to be in love? What does it mean to be a person? And in that work, I started to grow more and more in touch with my own identity. And in doing so, it made me realize that I wanted to study something that was important to me and my community. And studying HIV was a really, I think, impactful way to sort of make my mark in my community and with those people that I loved and cared for. Moving on from deciding to study HIV preliminarily, my partners and I were living happily in San Francisco for many years together, and one day we got the unfortunate news that one of them had seroconverted. And it's a particularly traumatic event. It was as though I can't particularly recount the experience in dramatic detail. It was just kind of another day, but I can picture it vividly in my mind. Everything that we were doing, everything that we were saying, everything that we were thinking. And from that point, my vision of HIV went from one that was purely academic to one that was really deeply ingrained in my life. And so ever since then, as I've moved on in my career to being a professor at Northwestern, work has really trying to been focusing on bringing the research back to the community. So much of HIV research is focused on the virus. I want to do more research on the people. So just in a nutshell, that's my story.
Thanks, Jed. And before we move on to the others, could you tell us what the current treatments for HIV infection are, and how accessible are they?
Yeah, so just to give you some quick kind of, I hate to say it, but top line numbers, though I hate to reduce any of this to numbers. There's estimated to be about 38 million people currently living with HIV worldwide, and then 1.7 million new infections last year. HIV-related deaths really have dropped considerably since their peak, which was in 2004. But we are still losing nearly 700,000 people each year to AIDS and HIV-related comorbidities. Overall, the epidemic is estimated to have claimed about 33 million lives. And to put that in perspective, the COVID-19 epidemic has so far resulted in about 1 million deaths. But that being said, we have made really incredible progress, huge innovations in public health, community partnership, clinical practice, and biomedical research. And in particular, as you were saying, Alexa, the advent of antiretroviral therapies as a treatment to prevent the onset of AIDS, also as a use in preventative medicine, really stands as sort of one of the miracles of modern medicine and has changed the face of this disease from a death sentence to one of more chronic illness. But that being said, there's still a long way to go. These therapies are not curative, and maintaining viral suppression requires daily administration of an antiretroviral cocktail throughout an individual's entire lifetime. And that's a monumental task for even the most advanced healthcare systems. So only about 2/3 of people currently living with HIV really have access to antiretroviral therapies. And even if you're on antiretroviral therapy and achieve viral suppression, there's still an increased risk for a host of other comorbidities, including cancer, neurological disorders, systemic inflammation, et cetera. And that's on top of the additional mental, psychological, financial, and other social pressures that can accompany those kind of health statuses. And of course, I would be amiss if I did not mention that this burden is not evenly distributed, and it disproportionately impacts those people in our communities who are most at risk and most vulnerable, and particularly people in resource-poor settings, communities of color, LGBT communities, et cetera. And so again, I want to emphasize these are top line numbers, but what it really matters at the end of the day is these are people's lives, individuals. And I think the goal of all of us on this call is to lift up those lives and improve these lives of each person.
Right. Thanks, Jed. And to transition off of that a bit, we aren't just dealing with HIV or AIDS. We have to address a person's mental state. So, Eddie, do you think fear of stigma, being judged, trauma are primary underlying issues? And you're the director of Women's HIV Program and Center to Advance Trauma-Informed Health. So can you tell us what your goal is with those two initiatives?
Sure. So just a little bit about me in the spirit of what Judd started. So I was, a 17-year-old in New York City, just coming out being gay at the height of the early AIDS epidemic, and was a little puppy AIDS activist, and got really involved with AIDS and HIV activism, because it was just an intersection of so many things, sexuality and fame and race and, a dysfunctional, negligent government and politics and death. And there was just so much death. And I sought out to become a doctor, to become a primary care doctor for people with HIV and AIDS. And I thought I'd be working with gay men who were dying. And I ended up working with women, and now women who are very much alive and living. And it was a really, my goal originally was to have a creative, loving space to provide really good quality care to people who were not typically getting that level of care. And that's kind of what has driven me. I had a little cartoon I made as a college kid, and it was called the Refriskiment Center. And the idea was that people could go there and get frisky again. But that was really naive, but it's actually what's animating me now. And but to your point, we do an excellent job in our clinic using these amazing medications to help people get their virus under control. And almost 90% of our patients have an undetectable viral load, which means HIV ostensibly isn't going to hurt them at all, and they're not contagious to their partners. They're actually not contagious even with no protection to their partners. It's really quite a medical miracle. And there was essentially kind of a declaration of victory in the HIV community. Most people just feel like we've got this. And I was at this lecture relatively recently by Anthony Fauci, and he showed the HIV Care Continuum, which is the continuum of care from being first diagnosed to getting your HIV controlled and having an undetectable viral load. And he said, our goal as HIV scientists and physicians should be to get people into this category, HIV, virus under control, because those people are doing great. And I was flooded because those people aren't doing great. If you go actually into an HIV program, if you go into my program, 40% of the patients are using hard drugs, crystal meth, heroin, or crack. Half of the patients have diagnosed depression. Many of my patients are living with abusive partners. Most of my patients are not out about their HIV status, which means they don't actually have really friends to support them in their lives. And then way too many of our patients are dying. And they're dying not just from HIV, but they're dying from murder, suicide, addiction-related overdose, addiction-related organ disease, and then AIDS. But when they die from AIDS, they're not really dying from AIDS. They're dying from depression or substance use, stopping their medications, and then dying from AIDS. And when we paused for a minute and asked ourselves the question, like, what's going on here? The epiphany we came to was that the common denominator, they were all different individuals, the women who were dying and living in our program, but the common denominator was a lifelong history of significant trauma as a child and as an adult that led initially to most of them getting infected with HIV in the first place, and then contributed directly to their deaths in the cases of the women who were murdered, and then indirectly to their deaths in the cases of the women who died from substance use, overdose, and organ disease. And so it was that epiphany that trauma was driving the HIV epidemic, but then when the meds came, unmasking all of the other trauma-related conditions that women and men both are struggling with, that led us to commit to changing our model of care from one that's really focused on the biomedical to one that is focused on helping understand and address the trauma in the lives of the individuals living with HIV. Alexa, I think you might be on mute.
Can't hear you, Alexa.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I'll repeat the question, Eddie. I said, what are the benefits you've seen since implementing trauma-informed care?
Well, the benefits have been, it's kind of transcendent because it changes everything, really. It really becomes the question of who you are. As a clinician, what is our job as a clinician? And if more and more the people are coming up as HIV doctors weren't around early in the epidemic. And so unfortunately, I think a younger generation of AIDS doctors thinks their job is to get people's virus under control. And that is very technical. That's much more of a technician. But I think if you expand our level of responsibility to the person and open our eyes to the individual and say, okay, what is really going to hurt this person? What are they suffering from? What is interfering with them being safe and connected and happy? That changes your whole experience and job in relation to that person. And it becomes much bigger than being a technocrat. It becomes about being a healer and about connecting with individuals and seeing them as individuals and their beauty and complexity and distress, and being open to asking yourself, what can I do to actually be of meaningful benefit to this individual? Because frankly, I think the bar has been set way, way too low for success in HIV care. The bar is basically get them undetectable so they can't transmit to other people, and so we can say they're undetectable. But if you change that bar and you say, can I help this person be safe? And can I help this person, be empowered in their lives and really realize their dreams and their hopes and not die, honestly, from other things, it changes the whole character of what you do. And I'll just end this answer by saying, I think a lot of people are scared to broaden their perspective of their responsibility in medicine. That you as a clinician would be scared. Other clinicians are scared to think, oh my God, I now have to deal with the fact that somebody had childhood sexual abuse, or I now have to deal with somebody's crack addiction, or how angry they are, or how at risk and risk-taking they are. That's overwhelming to me. I really just want to focus on getting their viral load undetectable. And what I would say is that allowing yourself that space to see and connect, it becomes a much more joyful experience because it allows for connection, it allows for relevancy. And what you find is that you're right, you can't do everything. You can't just check all those boxes. You can't, have that person stop smoking crack cocaine. You can't undo childhood sexual abuse. You can't get people out of intimate partner violent relationships, but you can be present with them and you can think and collaborate with them. And it's remarkable how much you can do. And I think what we concluded was that it's through partnerships with others and community organizations that we can extend the power of the medical realm and medical care to actually go deep and get to those deeper issues that are driving the shame, the stigma, a lot of the substance use, a lot of the suffering, that it's not all on us as clinicians. And what gives me a lot of hope is that we've done this before. Early in HIV, the beginning of HIV care in Ryan White HIV care systems, that's the federal system that provides funding for primary care programs with wraparound psychosocial services to low-income people with HIV. We didn't have medicines. From 1981 until 1996, the medicines didn't work. So for 15 years, we worked with people. And as Judd said, we didn't work with them as viruses. We worked with them as people. And the question we asked ourselves is, what can we possibly do to make their life better? How can we help them survive? And if they're going to die, how can we help them die with dignity and in community? And we did that mostly through breaking tons of rules and opening up the walls of the clinic to community organizations and partnerships, because we knew we did not have the tools to fix all of these problems. But that wasn't our goal. We weren't just trying to fix everything. We were trying to be healers and lovers and part of their lives and help them. And so it was that spirit then that drove such magnificent care of people with HIV that we're losing more and more as we get mesmerized with the biotechnology. And I think what trauma-informed healthcare for me has done it's welcomed that whole realm back in, so that it's the best of both worlds. It's the biotechnology and biomedical innovations, plus an understanding and welcoming of who these individuals are. And I'll end by just saying Rodessa is an example to me of a partnership that we made to go deep into the healing that our patients needed, that I, as a person and clinician, physician, could not do myself.
Right. So, Rodessa, you've devoted many years to the HIV community. So, tell us about the Medea Project and tell us about the healing and transformation you've seen while you've been working on that.
Well, in the beginning, the California Arts Council invited me to go into the jails and teach aerobics to incarcerated women. I was totally curious, and I said, "Okay, I'll go. I'll do this." As well as I'm from a family of I had 8 brothers, and as an African American woman, I I know something about prison. My brother Richard was at Attica, and I was with my mother and father, and we suffered that weight, that horrible assault on that prison, and that was a long, long time ago. And then, but it planted something in me as to knowing and caring about imprisoned people. Back to what I think what Eddie and Judd have stressed is the humanity of it all. It's back to us being human beings. We have to be human beings first in a lot of ways. Fast forward to Eddie's talking about being in New York. As he was talking, I was in New York, and I was my brother Bill T. Jones and his partner Arnie Zane decided that they in being HIV positive, they were going to give AIDS a face. So this is the other part of it. Let us talk about this. Let us talk about health and healing is very political. It's very, very political. It's very ancient and very old. The idea of sitting around a circle and speaking to each other. What happened to you? When I work with incarcerated women, I'm constantly reminding them, you have a right to a life. You have a right to a life. And they have a very hard time making sense of that, making sense of, because as Eddie was describing, they're depressed. They just want to, if they're in jail, they've already failed again. And it's like, what do we do with our lives as we sit here? And what they wanted to do though was talk. And I found ways for them to talk about who they were and what they were doing. And I gave them space to understand that there's no shame here. There's no judgment here. It's about you finding your voice. And then, as I often tell people, Kamala Harris sent me an actual invitation to a party, a fundraiser that Eddie was having through the hospital. And I went and I met Eddie. And in the course of that, there were people there that I knew from all my various lives as an artist in communities. And Eddie and I started talking, and Eddie was talking about my methodology because during the course of the evening we had discussed it. And he said, could you take this methodology that you have and get women to come out about their status? And so therein lies my place here at this table on this Zoom, is that as Eddie was talking, one of the most thrilling things, I would invite him to these conferences. There's a young woman's conference that Senator Leno used to always have. I would go into the jails and I'd take Eddie. I had a doctor. I'd bring Eddie into the jails. And the conversation would include HIV, AIDS, HIV protection, prevention. And all of a sudden there was a doctor there talking to teenagers. And I remember one of the things that you said, Eddie, to those girls, you said, well, let's get it straight. Before we can talk about anything, you got to decide what you like. What kind of sex do you like? And I was thrilled as a mother, a grandmother, and as a woman who had once been a teenage girl. Nobody had ever said to me, what kind of sex do you like? And then back to Judd saying about his community and finding, gay people and trying to make sense of that circle. Eddie introduced us all to a larger circle of human beings. And my work has a lot to do with getting women to come out about where they've been, as well as what I do as the listener, as the facilitators. I remind them how powerful they are. You're not broken. HIV is a health condition. It's not a crime. Where we live in the society where there's so much silence around, silence and shame is useless. It's just useless if we're going to forward our lives and also give meaning to folks less than us, people on the not less to us, excuse me, I don't mean that, as much as marginally, economically, culturally, folks, we could all be called to the center. As I think about healthcare and how it is so important in this election that we look at healthcare for everybody, because it is a political right. That you cannot live your life if you're worried about going to the hospital. I'm dealing with women right now in the Medea project they don't go to doctors, they go to emergency. when they have a problem. And consequently, I have lost people through that process of this. They know nothing about their rights as human beings. So my work has a lot to do with getting women to stand up and say, this happened to me. I'm mad as hell about this. I'm scared about this. And then with my folks, my actresses and multicultural choreographers, singers, we put it on stage and we put music to it. We put lighting to it. My partner Idris Akamor comes in with his incredible musical ability, and we make these stunning performances that looks at the lives of people that we call marginal, but I call the work public communion. This is public communion, not just a night of theater, but here we're going to gather and we're going to hear each other, because I really believe that once you hear somebody's story, you're changed forever. And I'm so grateful that I'm in this circle with you all today, where it's about us changing and expanding and respecting the intersectionality of the work, you know, because all of that matters. All human beings do matter, you know, and we're here in this space. And I'll just stop there for now. But storytelling has saved my life, and I feel like we all need to be given a voice to say this happened to me. And back to New York. When I was first working, I was working at La Mama in New York, and this was before there was, as Eddie was saying, about no medicine, nothing other than that we had each other. I would go to these gatherings at La Mama in one of their theaters, and that would be streetwalkers, whores, that would be showing women how to put a condom on a banana. You know, I mean, it was like, how do we save our lives? I remember just women would be a little bit embarrassed. They'd be titillated, but there'd be all these women from various walks of life. And there'd be some prostitute, somebody who stood up and said, this is how I make my living. And look, honey, you got to be able to bag the beast. You know, it was just, and women like, hee. But at the same time, we're all leaning in, because all of a sudden we're dealing with a condom, and the banana becomes somewhat of the penis. It was just very interesting that with like the pandemic, the AIDS epidemic has brought in another wave of knowing and being and caring and loving. I mean, there's all this other stuff, death and dying, but it forces us to all sit in that circle and lean in. And I'm so proud to be a part of the healing force in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Thanks, Rodessa. So to bring it back to Jed a bit, you mentioned that your commitment to HIV research was strengthened, you know, after seeing your friends go through the struggles of HIV infection. And it sounds like the cure is more than just the pills. So how would you define a cure to HIV? And in your opinion, what will finding that cure really require? Who are the players that need to get involved?
Yeah, it's a complicated question and has a couple different answers. From a strictly biomedical perspective, the idea is a cure would be some intervention that makes somebody unable to transmit the virus and clears them from any negative health consequences down the road without the need for further intervention. That's sort of the broad working definition, and that could include things from an effective and long-lasting neutralizing antibody response to some kind of medication that could clear the virus from the body long-term. Research is working on those kind of biomedical approaches, and that's where a lot of the focus, at least in current HIV/AIDS research, has been shifting. But there's also been a lot of discussion about, you know, what does a cure look like if we're not able to have, you know, this magic pill that makes the virus disappear? Can we get people to both a physical and a mental state where they are living their best possible lives and they don't have to really think about the virus, where the virus has nothing really to do with them except for that is part of who they are? And again, that is, I think, an area of not only research, but I think ongoing work that Eddie and Rodessa can probably speak better to. But I'm hopeful and encouraged. I think every single generation we're seeing all of these various innovations that bring us closer and closer to to these various aspects of what a cure would actually look like. And I think it's pretty remarkable that we're even talking about it. At least from a biomedical perspective, even 10 years ago, if you were to go up on a stage and give a presentation and say, I'm going to research how to cure HIV, people would laugh you off the stage. That's a goal that's not even on the table. And that conversation has shifted dramatically to where not only is that conversation on the table, that is now the stated and active goal of many foundations and researchers. So. But yeah, I think maybe Eddie or Rodessa could speak a little bit more to what their concept of cure would mean.
Absolutely. I wanted to relate the same question to Eddie. What would you say, how would you define a cure? What would you say is needed to get there?
Well, I think I would ask a different question. I think there's a number of different scenarios where HIV is cured. But I think the legacy of HIV and AIDS, if we do get to a cure, it'd be a shame if the legacy was purely biomedical, because what we've learned in the first 15 years of the epidemic, from 1981 to 1996, is that we can do more than just give people pills as doctors, that we can actually take much better care of them as individuals instead of as viruses, that we can think of healthcare as a healing endeavor, and that we can partner with the community, and we can ask ourselves questions, big questions, like what is really interfering with this person's safety and wellness and well-being and happiness and hope, and be able to take them in and be present. And that reality that was the Ryan White HIV care system from when it first started in the early 90s to 1996, or late 80s to 1996, was a thing of wonder. It was a beautiful thing. It was the best care that this country has ever offered. And that next decade, from 1996 to 2006, was the best care, because we had all of that attitudinal approach towards individuals and really being willing to ask the hard questions of what's interfering with their lives, and have an idea of our role as being broader than givers of pills. And we had the pills so that we could do both. We could help them survive HIV with the pills, but then we can also look at their trauma and their substance use and their depression and their obesity and diabetes and their heart disease, and ask, what is driving all of this? And I think we now really know that if we can understand people better. And the way I understand people now, the reason trauma-informed care is so helpful for me is it helps demystify people. If someone's coming and yelling at me, if someone's coming and they're just killing themselves by smoking crack cocaine and they have lung disease, or they're killing themselves by being with really scary partners, it's not a mystery to me why they're doing that. They're doing that because preposterously terrible things have happened to them and continue to happen to them. And this is how they're coping. And that understanding is just not pervasive. People literally don't understand why people have a concept of why people are the way they are, why they're sick, why they're behaving the way they are. And the concept or the underlying philosophy of trauma-informed care allows me to be more patient and more compassionate, and then link them to the types of care they really need and deserve. So my hope with the cure is that HIV doesn't declare victory. The field of HIV medicine doesn't ignore the whole first 15 years of its innovations, which were care innovations, not biomedical innovations, and then declare victory with a cure and forget that our health system is terrible. Like, it's totally misaligned with the public health needs of our patients. We have a joke in our clinic that's not really a joke, which is that if our patients went in the general primary care clinic at our very university, they would call the police. Because this is a Black woman who's using crack cocaine who's kind of pissed off, and there's a line to 911 and the police, and we feel differently. We welcome them with love and understanding, and the health system really isn't set up for so much of what ails our society, and HIV really should be a guiding light, a beacon for the care model that we've developed. And that should be what we present to the world and to the rest of US healthcare, in addition to the cure. And I think unless we really bring that into care now, while we're waiting for a cure, people will just go down the easier road, which is hard, meaning what Judd does for his day job, which is invent this stuff, but easier for the clinicians just to go down the road of this is a biomedical endeavor, which it should be much bigger than that.
Well,
can I ask a quick follow-up question from Eddie? So, I really liked how you kind of split that up and, bringing the idea of a cure to there's, you have to cure the virus, but there's also the trauma, and a holistic cure isn't going to be obtained unless you address sort of both of those. So people could theoretically be cured or happily living free from trauma, but still have the virus. They could also be cured of the virus, but still be carrying the weight of it. Do you think that's a fair way to break it up, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I mean, I think, most of our patients die with an undetectable viral load. That's absurd. So we've been able to actually treat their HIV, which is essentially a cure. They take one pill a day, they have no side effects, and that's it's that easy. And so if they can take that one pill a day and they have access to it, but if they die from an overdose, like we did a study of all the deaths in San Francisco that have occurred, women living with HIV are 25 times more likely to die of an overdose than the general population of women in the state of California. I mean, 25 times more likely to die of an overdose. And, they're 7 times more likely to die of lung disease. Men are almost 3 times more likely to die of suicide than the general population. Like the orders of magnitude of risk to their health other than HIV is so staggeringly high that I think, there's no cure for trauma. It's more, do we have a health system that can help people that can help people heal from the impacts of trauma, but then also cope with persistent traumas that aren't in our control. We can't cure, as clinicians, racism. We can't undo people's childhood sexual abuse, but we can help people heal from it, and we can help people cope more healthfully from a lot of the stressors that are really intractable. And so I think it's really a health systems change that would go along with a cure that HIV has really modeled for us in the early parts of the epidemic. Like we've seen this work. It's just that we don't have the will to really do it in it's not happening anywhere else in medicine, in primary care. These community partnerships, this activism, the spirit, the love, the connection. And so we really would do ourselves a disservice to forget in HIV that we invented this model of boundary breaking, far more effective care that we really should extend throughout the system.
Great. And, I think many people go through life without an idea really of what it's like to live with HIV. And there are certain stories and realities that many people are blind to due to things like privilege or health even. And so, Rodessa, can you tell us what it's like? I know that you're full of stories of the work that you've done. And so perhaps you'd like to share one as an example. I know that you mentioned Deborah.
Yes. As Eddie was speaking, I was thinking about theater for the 21st century and the games that we've created, where we've elevated. Stop, look, and listen. It is such a great game if we're talking about race, if we're talking about health. It's like, can you really stop, look, and listen to somebody so that they will feel as though they are being heard on all these levels? And for people who are attempting to speak, I encourage them to be as clear as you can be so we're communicating with each other, because it is a gift. It is a joy that here we do. This is a part of healing. It's that we've got to listen to each other. People have got to feel as though they're being heard and that they're part of a community. And working with women to build their stories, I'm always saying, talk to your younger self, to a woman who is dealing with HIV. What is the cautionary tale for a young girl about the journey that you've already taken? And that's an exercise in itself. Women write, they stand up, they attempt to read, and in the course of that, the trauma comes through. The constant rape and assault that's a part of a lot of people's lives. The feeling of abandonment. when I listen to people's response to Black Lives Matter, and they'll say, well, all lives matter. But if you can you imagine standing in the shoes of somebody like a George Floyd who says, hey, man, you're killing me. And the cop is like, oh, well, and people are standing around saying, hey, that's enough. But largely, it's like, and I'm still feeling it, and I hate to feel it. It's like feeling like you're not human. And that's why, as Eddie was saying, somebody would call the police because you're jumping up and down, motherfucker, blah, 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 blah. And everybody's going, oh my God, she is dangerous. And you can't see into the soul of that person who's simply saying, help me, because it's about over. Or when people are diagnosed with HIV, it's like, oh, well, what else can happen to me? That is a scary, sad position to be in. And for me, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about what has happened to you. That's what I do as a arts facilitator. Let's really gather around and talk about the A, the B, the C, the D of your life now. And it's like, well, who cares? And I say, you'd be amazed at the amount of people who care. Trauma must simply be recognized as very much a part of all of our journeys in a lot of ways. Us as healers, as doctors, as scientists, that it sits like a quiet monster at the very middle, the very center of our experience as we reach out for others, as we go to the edge, as we embrace the, quote, marginalized. Trauma is very, very real. And it's only been in the last few years, the last decade or so, that it's common language that people have been traumatized. It's my mother, when Rodney King was beat on television and then the cops were cleared, it was my mother, and she had never said this to us. It was Easter Sunday at my house, and we're all, in our ferocity, we're complaining about the government and the people and blah, 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 blah. And my mother said very quietly, white folks got to realize that it ain't slavery time no more. And my mother never talked like this to us. And we kind of lean in, and she goes, and I said, what, Mama? She said, it ain't slavery time no more. She says, I remember being 9 years old and being taken to lynchings. My father had been driven away, and I was still living on the same plantation where my mother and my grandmother had lived. And they were taken to lynchings to see their neighbors and their friends be hung from branches. My mother remembered there was a woman who was pregnant, and she's begging for the life of her husband. And the guy with the gun, the white guy, turns and knocks her down and then proceeds to stomp her. And my mother said, I saw the baby, the fetus, come out of this one. She's 9 years old. And we're looking at her, and she's saying, and look, let me tell you something. They had shotguns pointed at us. We had to watch all of this. And this is the same mama that I grew up with who let everybody come home. I think about my mother, I think, how did she do it? That she just didn't perpetually hate white people, that she wasn't a cauldron of feeling, but she decided to take on this other mantle of goodness and a humanity that had to do with maybe her understanding trauma to such a degree that she assumed other people had these experiences too. And as we move into the 21st century, I think our study with health and science and HIV and even COVID. I remember someone saying about George Floyd's death, and they were saying, well, why did all the children hit the streets? And everybody responded so incredibly, profoundly positive. And I think it was a newspaper person who said, because of the pandemic, we were all home. We saw this happen on television. It wasn't that it was a hearsay. We were all sitting around our televisions, and our children turned to us and went, what the hell? And I remember Barack Obama saying, we must appeal to our better angels. And I feel like that's what youth has done in the streets, and it's back to HIV. I feel like the appealing to our better angels and knowing that this epidemic, HIV, as well as COVID, it's going to take a lot more humanity. It's going to take us all practicing the art of being a human being to get through this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So a little caveat to get off what you just said about COVID. We have an audience question. Either of you can answer. It says, what are the parallels you see, both with research and social implications with HIV, especially in the early days, and SARS-CoV-2? Judd?
Well, at least from the research perspective, it's been absolutely remarkable to see the amount of scientific progress that we've made in understanding SARS-CoV-2 based on the work and the framework and the tools and the things that we learned by studying HIV. You know, early in the HIV epidemic, prior to the emergency medical records, there were very careful contact tracing and case studies that established how the virus was spreading in communities that were at risk and how to begin protecting yourself. And we saw those very same tools being implemented early on in the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic, before we had a good idea of how it could spread or where it could spread or who was most at risk. And that's been supplemented by these various techniques that were developed over the decades with HIV, including how to best use and leverage these now electronic medical records to better understand the virus in the clinic. And that's moved to how we can do contact tracing better, how we can work with public health departments, and then even molecular surveillance. How can we find out who has contracted it from who, so we can make sure that we're protecting everybody as best as possible. It's really been a roller coaster of a ride as a virologist, watching this epidemic unfold and seeing all the various parallels with HIV.
Great, thank you. We have another audience question. It says, what can the community do to contribute to HIV and AIDS programs and initiatives?
Can I just add one thing to the COVID question for just a moment?
Yeah.
So I'd say there's a couple more really dramatic parallels in addition to what Judd just mentioned. So, there is profound government neglect. At the beginning of HIV, there was, people with HIV were literally laughed at by the Reagan administration in their news conferences. There was deliberate neglect of the people who were getting infected because they were Black and brown and gay and poor, and not thought of as meaningful. There is a radical racial disparity in who's getting who gets HIV and who dies from HIV, and there's the same disparity in who gets COVID and dies from COVID. Black African American individuals are far more likely to die from COVID when they get COVID compared to white individuals with COVID, and that's not genetic. That's because the Black community has been traumatized. More so than the white community has been traumatized. And that trauma leads to smoking, lung disease, it leads to heart disease, it leads to liver disease, and a whole mess of other medical issues, both because of the biological impacts of trauma and the behavioral impacts of trauma that then predispose individuals to die once they get COVID. And so you have illness and death far more likely in Black populations. And Rodessa, do you mind if I mention what happened with your family in Florida?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so the last thing is, I'll just say the care provided to low-income Black minority communities when they get COVID is just totally different than the care provided to upper-income white individuals with COVID. So one of Rodessa's relatives, or actually her whole family in this one location in Florida, got COVID in the same household, and I was helping take care of them from afar, and one of them needed to be hospitalized, and the care that she received in this hospital in Tampa, Florida, was just preposterously bad. I mean, they discharged her COVID positive to a house filled with individuals who are not known to be COVID positive. While she was still infectious, they tried to discharge her way before she was ready to go home. And that just wouldn't happen at UCSF or at Columbia Hospital in Manhattan. And so the same types of impact, racial disparities of the impact and the deaths a negligence that happened in early AIDS is happening identically in COVID currently.
Thanks, Eddie. Anybody want to take a stab at this question? What can the community do to contribute to HIV and AIDS programs and initiatives?
I would just jump off and say right away, people, listen to the political raps that are going down and who's talking about HIV, AIDS programs and initiatives. Vote, my fellow citizens. Hey, vote for that person that at least giving it some lip service, of nothing else. This is one of the main things to happen. And then support these organizations that are doing this kind of work. Don't make a joke out of people who have HIV, AIDS. One of the women that came into my group, when she disclosed to her family, she opened up to her family about having AIDS. There were people that didn't want to drink behind her. They didn't want to eat off the same plate. Come on now. This is the 21st century and people are behaving this way. Be informed. But back to everything, please vote. I mean, you might not even, I'm not that thrilled with what we got up on the table, but we've got to deal with the fact that it is about saving the lives of all of us. And that is one thing we can do as a community. Pay attention to these issues, these epidemics, and be involved. It's not going to go away. It's going to take all of us. I would just say that right off the bat. Yeah. Oh, and I want to say one thing to Judd. Now, I'm an actor and I'm an artist. I love the term molecular surveillance. It sounds so science fiction. I got to do something with this. These little strange germs driving around in cars. It's like, I love that molecular surveillance. I love that. I'm going to feel it. I got to do something with it.
Oh, definitely. Email me. I have some ideas.
I love it. Yes.
So we have another great question. It's, what can researchers do to contribute to the healing from the trauma caused by viral epidemics, such as HIV or SARS-CoV-2?
I mean, I'll answer briefly from my field. So the field of trauma-informed healthcare. So it is completely clear. Trauma as a child, individual level trauma, family level trauma, and community level trauma is if not the single primary driver of most illness and death in this country. The proportion of an illness caused by a single factor is called the population attributable fraction. And for depression, just looking at early childhood trauma, 42% of depression can be attributed to just early childhood trauma. The same percentages can be looked at with substance use, obesity, and many other illnesses. And so the correlation between trauma and health is indisputable. I think that the science that we are working on now is, how do you take that understanding and operationalize it in a clinic and say, okay, we know that it underlies most of the diseases. We know that it perpetuates most of the diseases, but how can we change our care to harness that understanding to provide better care, to interrupt the impact of that trauma on those later diseases? And once people have those diseases, how do we treat those diseases better, knowing that their origin was in trauma? We know that it's possible through research studies to treat substance use or depression or obesity better if we know about trauma and treat their trauma and PTSD along with their other diseases. But where we're at scientifically now is, how do we operationalize that in our very messy, very broken primary care system? How do we take these primary care clinics and turn them into healing centers where they don't all have to rely on Rodessa individually? How do we build a scalable system of trauma-informed healthcare that can interrupt the impact that we know exists between trauma and health? And we're in the early science of that, and that's what my whole career is focused on.
Anybody else want to add to this? Although I think you did a fantastic job at answering that.
I just want to also just piggyback on that. Eddie, one of the things I learned when I got to know you was the whole idea about dealing with trauma and just making people safe. I remember a friend of mine was going through some stuff, and you had said, well, if he's HIV positive, I probably can get him better housing. I can probably, and that was a new thought for me. Like, oh, that a doctor could reach out past everything and help somebody find a better, safer, more substantial housing situation. And it's so important if people are going to get well, if people are going to get better, and you just like informed my own work with that, as well as Eddie has everybody, all of the women call him Dr. Eddie, and it makes them feel so warm and fuzzy. Seriously, I think it's wonderful. I just think it's wonderful that you're available as a human being, to work with them, to talk with them, even you working with my family, you're working with my family when my nephew who's HIV positive was having these problems in New York. All I could say to my family was, I want you to meet Dr. Eddie. And Eddie, you were just wonderful at the things that you offered and gave to my sister and her family around just the whole idea of a team, that it's a team that takes care of people with HIV, and my sister still talks about that, and I so appreciate you and your own approach to it, because these are things that totally open my own ideas and eyes as to what healing could be on all aspects. It has to be all of us caring and working in that way. So thank you.
And let me just say, return the love. A plug for this perspective on care. Like, because this is the type of care that I'm trying to develop, I get to meet Rodessa. So, and then I get to spend time watching Rodessa work with my patients doing theater, working with some of my patients who could barely speak, literally could not form words because of their decades of crack addiction. Working with them, watching them, being outside my clinic, meeting Rodessa's family, learning myself that people can heal in ways that I was not, I could not provide myself. Like, these experiences are much more joyful for me, much more interesting. And I think being a primary care clinician is often really stressful and not very satisfying. I mean, you can make 2 or 3 times the income being a dermatologist, which is a completely nonsense profession, frankly. And why not just do that? And so the answer is because people care. But if you really, the richness that has come from meeting Rodessa and working with Rodessa and seeing her work with my patients, it's provided me so much joy. I'm so grateful for it. And that came with being willing to step out of the lane of just doing the checklist of doctory things that we're told to do and adhere to.
Great.
Thank you, Eddie.
So I think a main theme of this discussion has been looking at our role in the HIV epidemic. Is it to end the virus? Is it to treat the virus? Is it to treat the patients? And, looking at whose responsibility that is. So thank you all for commenting on that. I want to end with the question, how can researchers and the LGBTQ community work better together, more effectively to advance what still needs to be addressed? Anybody can go for this question.
Well, from my perspective, I think we need to do a little bit more to break down those walls. When you think of a laboratory researcher, you think of them in their little white jacket, and then they go into their little white building and they work with a test tube, and then someday a pill comes out of that building. And that's it sterilizes the humanity of not only the people who the scientists are trying to serve, but the humanity of the scientists themselves. We all have stories, we all have interests, we all have backgrounds, we all have ways that we think and that we work. And integrating ourselves a little bit more into the community and listening to what the needs are, and then addressing those needs directly with the research question. It might not sound like rocket science, but making sure that those are all connected and we're all working together is really important. So that would be my 2-minute take on it.
But I guess I would add, from my perspective, just set the bar higher. I think we're often taught, I do research too, different type of research, and we're really taught to be reductionist, like to to not get messy, not think really big, to think really small, clear, so that we get very clear results and successes. And oftentimes
stay in that test tube.
Yeah, and the lane is often focused on succeeding with the research instead of succeeding with what is really threatening and killing our patients. And they're related, but I think people need to be willing to be present and ask and answer more complex questions that are going to end up that'll end up being more meaningful, and to set our bar higher for what a successful outcome in the field of HIV is. And the successful outcome to me is that individual living with HIV can survive and it can lead a healthy and safe and happy life. And to say that that's not our job, that we can't have that impact, that these things are out of control, is just not true, and it's irresponsible. And it's actually not very fun. It's way more fulfilling, much bigger, more challenging, much more of an adventure to take on the bigger issues that seem so daunting, but are so much more important often than what we're being told to research and focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I would just say insist on inclusion, as we move forward. It ain't gonna work if everybody is not in the room, and everybody looks like everybody. We're brown, yellow, red, black, and insist on that kind of inclusion wherever there is any discussion about it. And a friend of mine, he just reminded me of a project I did with him years ago. We traveled around the country doing something called Don't Go There, Theater Without the Tube. And it was all about HIV from the perspective of people being irresponsible. And we would create these incredibly ratchet situations where somebody's having sex with everybody, and they're like, and the audience gets to argue with these people about how irresponsible. It was brilliant, because we went into communities that hadn't even thought about HIV, and all of a sudden people are taking a stand and saying, you've got to be more responsible. And this actor was wonderful. He was just like, oh, later for you people, I'll do what I want, and it was just it was an amazing way to open up the conversation to communities that didn't even know they had an opinion. And that's Albert Cunningham, and I hope he's watching. Thank you, Albert Cunningham, for your early work with HIV and Black men. Thank you so much.
Great.
Can I make one last point? Yeah, sorry. The one thing that I was really struck with by our conversation today was also that, there's a place for everybody here to contribute, no matter what your strengths are. If you're a scientist or a clinician, or you're an actress, or you're a media producer, everybody can play parts by playing to their own strengths. So there's room for everybody in this fight.
Thanks, Jed. So as we wrap up our time together, I'd like to thank the three of you for being part of this discussion and sharing your valuable insight, and also for the work that you do around HIV research and community outreach, and making sure that AIDS is not a silent killer. And thank you as well to our viewers for joining us. While you're here, we welcome you to subscribe to QVI TV to stay tuned for our next episode. And I'd really like to end with a video from one of Rodessa's works called Birthright. I'll put it up on screen and leave you guys with that. Hold on, I don't think you can hear it.
Not yet, no.
I raised my arms, tilt my head, ready and frightened. Oh heaven, I am your bird. I was tired of being out there on the streets, smoking my life away. At one point, it was chaos. Went to jail for a week, got out of hard. Did they have a bed for me? They said yes. I went with the clothes on my back, tired of smoking crack, selling right from running drugs. To begin, you must let go. And letting go is the hardest thing of all. When I went to the doctor, every time I breathe, I grab my lungs. It hurts to breathe when I'm trying to talk. When I tried to smoke crack, I couldn't feel nothing. The doctor gave me 4 transfusions. I didn't have enough blood in me. I had fluid on my heart and lung. Here's an irony. When you stop needing to land, the ground reappears. Stone, like a pillow. Her name is Surrender. They put me in ICU for 2 days. I had 105-degree fever. I didn't know what was wrong with me. They ran some tests. I had not TB, tuberculosis, all at the same time. That's when I found out I had full lung cancer. As I was lying there, my mother and my auntie came to my bedside. I was feeling excited. That's when the doctor said, "Go, you only have 5 more years." They rushed me into the operating room to get the fluid off my heart and lungs. Or else, I would die. He abandonado la planeta. I have left the ditch. I stopped sobbing. That thick blanket of exhaustion and unanswered questions like soldiers lined up. No more ditch. The last thing I remember, my mother sitting on the bench, saying, "My baby, my baby, my baby." They put me to sleep. My grandmother appeared and said, "It's not time yet." Lifting my heart on its fragile chair, I smiled, new, shyly. The next time I saw my mother saying, "Thank you, God, for bringing her to oh, heaven, I am your bird." They took me to my room. When I woke up, I said, "Thank you, God, I can breathe again." Oh, heaven, I am your bird. I thank God for giving me another chance to live and tell my story. I get up like a child in the morning, hungry, so hungry at last for breakfast.
Yeah, that's members of the Medea Project. Can you hear me? That's members of the Medea Project. That's Lisa Frias and Deborah King. And that was Deborah's story. And I so appreciate them. And I appreciate Bruce Sheehan, who did the film. Thank you so much. It's just amazing when I look at that work. And thank you, Alex. And thank you, Judd. And thank you, Eddie. And let's do it again, kids.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you all being on this panel. And again, thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much.
Be well.
You too.
Yes.